Shabbat Shalom. This morning, Bethel joins synagogues and Jews around the country for what's being called, for short, Repro Shabbat, a themed Shabbat organized by National Council of Jewish Women to bring Jewish communities together to learn about reproductive freedom as a Jewish value. Last month, Rabbi Harris led us in a text study of Jewish views on abortion. And with sensitivity and nuance, he led us through a deep dive into many of our traditional texts on this topic, including the core biblical text, which comes from this week's parsha, from Mishpatim. So after we study this text again today, we'll do a close reading of it together. I invite us to stretch ourselves in two ways. First, to listen to new voices of those impacted by reproductive rights, and including voices we might not have thought about. And my second stretching exercise for us this morning is to reflect on the language that we use in these conversations. We'll start with the Torah text. The core biblical origin for later Jewish law surrounding abortion is from Exodus chapter 21. If men are fighting, one of them pushes a pregnant woman, and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, then the one responsible shall be fined monetary damages. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life. In this case, which is not abortion, but an accidental miscarriage, the Torah makes it clear by distinguishing between the two potential outcomes that, in this case, the fetus does not have the status of personhood. The loss of pregnancy is a serious harm for which there is monetary damage. There would be awarded monetary damages. But in the more serious case, if other damage ensues, if there is a loss of the life of the mother in this case, then the crime in this biblical legal example is manslaughter. And in this biblical world, the punishment for that crime is capital punishment. So that's a lot. In other words, the gist that we take from this hypothetical case is that there is a difference between potential life and life. Therefore, if the health of a pregnant person is at stake, the obligation of pikuach nefesh, of saving a life, is the primary concern. And in that case, abortion is not only permitted, but is required by Jewish law. Now, there is a lot more to say about this, and really none of it is hotly debated or very controversial from the perspective of our Jewish tradition, of Jewish law. From early rabbinic law to our medieval commentators and to our modern legal decision makers, our modern poskim, really there is generally consensus around these, what we take from our legal tradition. And there's something else that all of these sources, all of these voices have in common, which is that these laws were written, I'll say 99.9% of them, were written by people without the potential to become pregnant themselves. Now, for my first stretching exercise, to lift up the voices and experiences of women and all people who have reproductive rights. A little bit of context is, for me, that I have lived in diverse communities, diversity of race and sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, and this has taught me and stretched my assumptions and inspired me. And so today I bring voices and experiences to remind us that the current debates about reproductive rights impact many people, including those who come to mind when we first think about it immediately, and those who might not. I'll share 3 very short first-person stories collected by National Council of Jewish Women for today. This is the voice of Stephanie. When I was 17, I was not able to get an abortion without the notification and presence of my parents. I searched the internet for ways to end my own pregnancy. I even considered throwing myself down the stairs or ending my life, knowing a pregnancy would be the end of my future. That is how desperate I was. Young people face a double-edged sword of stigma with their reproductive health care. If they continue their pregnancies, they are unsupported and deemed irresponsible. And if they pursue an abortion, we are stigmatized. That was Stephanie. This is the voice of Joy. I grew up in a small town in Michigan. The local family planning clinic wasn't open on weekends, and the nearest abortion provider was more than 50 miles away. Faced with a choice, I chose my education. I found my passion and built a career for myself. I fell in love and married an amazing woman. I am proud of who I am and what I do, and I know that I wouldn't have my education, my career, or my marriage if I hadn't had my abortion. This is the voice of Kazembe, a trans man. After surviving a rape that ended in an unwanted pregnancy, I went to a Planned Parenthood in my hometown to get an abortion. Often when we think of abortion access or even pregnancy and childbirth, we think of these as women's issues. This erases the experience of trans and gender nonconforming folks who also have abortions and give birth to children. I wish that folks understood that men have abortions too, that gender is separate from the ability to reproduce children, that every person who has the ability to create children is capable of determining when, if ever, is the right time to do it. That was Kazembe. Stephanie, Joy, and Kazembe represent the many people who have been and continue to be impacted when reproductive rights are under threat. Their stories are echoes of other stories of other people whom we might encounter in our own community or in our own families. Sharing these stories leads directly to my second stretching exercise for us this morning, to examine the power of language. Because the words that we use are powerful, and how we use them matters enormously. How could we be more inclusive with our language? Of course, reproductive rights are inextricably intertwined with women's rights. And also, women are not the only people who have reproductive rights. People with reproductive rights include some trans men, some non-binary and gender non-conforming and gender queer, and other people. Now, for many of us, I know this is already a lot, and we might not be sure what all of these terms mean, and that's okay. Let's take a moment to lean into this stretch. My hope is that rather than women, when we talk about abortion, when we talk about reproductive rights, more inclusive terms are people with reproductive rights, people who need abortion access, or pregnant people. And again, I say this because the words we use are so powerful. Last month, I participated in a gathering of faith leaders. We met just outside of the Supreme Court in a church. And it was an inspiring morning on so many levels. One teaching that was offered to our group of faith leaders was a reminder that we have to say the word abortion in order to lessen its stigma. We can't be afraid to say abortion. And I heard this teaching, and then later on in the morning, when we were all gathered on the steps of the Supreme Court, I remember looking up at this mosaic of signs that everyone was holding on all sides, big signs. And abortion was everywhere. The word abortion was everywhere. And I remember feeling the power of that word with a new intensity. And I remembered at that moment the teaching I had just heard earlier that morning, that we must learn to encounter and speak the word abortion without flinching. And I'll share that I am still working on doing this myself. According to a study published by the American Journal of Health, nearly 1 in 4 people who can become pregnant will have an abortion by the age of 45. We might wish that abortion were rare, but in fact, it is not. And so we are called on to reflect on how, as Jewish communities, how we can love and welcome anyone who has had or who will have an abortion. Abortion is a medical procedure that is sometimes required by Jewish law to preserve health and life, and is also consistent with our Jewish principles of bodily autonomy and human dignity. And abortion is a word that carries a lot of feelings, a lot of shame, a lot of stigma. And so rather than projecting more shame and more stigma onto those who have had or who will have an abortion, and rather than using euphemisms like termination, we can lessen the stigma and we can counter the shame if we can lead with our compassion. And so on this Repro Shabbat, although I am, of course, worried about the politics that are surrounding all of this, as a Jew, I am worried that this medical procedure that is not only allowed, but is in some cases required by Jewish law, will be banned or severely limited in this country. I want to thank you for your willingness to stretch with me today. First, to stretch by listening to more voices, and second, to be more inclusive and less stigmatizing in our language. Because we all have a stake in this. Either we are a person ourselves, or we love a person who is impacted by abortion access. I want to close with a blessing that is being recited in synagogues across the country this morning. God of our ancestors, Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, we affirm that you have created us each in your sacred image, endowed with the inherent right to dignity and autonomy. We ask that you guide us towards a caring and loving community and nation that reveres this dignity in each of us. We affirm that reproductive freedom, the sacred right to own the personhood of one's own body, is a fundamental part of the just society for which we strive in your name. We ask that you endow us with the strength and resolve that we need, because the path that lays ahead is challenging and we all need resilience, strength, and courage. We ask that you protect the people most impacted and marginalized among us, because it is they who are most at risk. May our country be a place of liberty and justice for all, and may our care for one another include care and respect for each other's right to good and affordable health care, including abortion care, and right to live safely and securely, as we each follow our path of conscience and the God we each do or do not believe in. Amen. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.